DCI Hugo Thorne, Murder on the Fairway. Chapter 1, Shadows on the Green. The frost glistened like scattered diamonds on the pristine fairways of the London City Golf Club. The early morning hush was broken only by the faint rustle of trees swaying in the breeze. It was a tranquil scene, almost serene, until it wasn't. Jim Craddock, the head groundskeeper, shuffled onto the course, his breath puffing out in small clouds. Mornings like these were his favorite. Quiet, uninterrupted moments before the bustle of the day began. But as he reached the third fairway, his steady footsteps faltered. A golf cart stood parked at an odd angle near the edge of the green, its headlights dimming as dawn broke. At first glance, Jim thought nothing of it. Perhaps someone had left it there after a late-night round. But as he approached, something didn't feel right. The figure slumped over the steering wheel was unmistakably Richard Halford, the club's head greenkeeper and Jim's superior. Richard's usually impeccable uniform was disheveled, his body unnaturally still. And then Jim saw it, a golf flagpole, its tip embedded in his chest, its bright colors stark against the dark fabric of his jacket. Jim staggered back, his heart pounding in his ears. He fumbled for his radio, his hands trembling. "This is Craddock," he stammered. There's been an incident on the third fairway. Get someone here now." The call sent ripples through the club's hierarchy. By the time the first responders arrived, the early morning peace had given way to murmurs of shock and confusion. A cordon was set up around the scene, the manicured grass trampled under hurried footsteps. Detective Chief Inspector Hugo Thorne arrived shortly after, stepping out of his unmarked car with a deliberate calm. He was a man accustomed to untangling the threads of human folly, his tall frame and sharp eyes giving him an air of quiet authority. Dressed in a dark coat that matched the somberness of the situation, Thorne moved toward the body with measured steps. Richard Halford lay slumped, his face pale and lifeless. The placement of the flagpole was chillingly deliberate, and Thorne's practiced eye noted every detail, the angle, the force, the precision. This wasn't an act of passion. It was something colder, more calculated. "What do we know so far?" Thorne asked, his voice steady. One of the officers stepped forward. "The groundskeeper who found him mentioned seeing Halford arguing with someone last night, but the description is vague, a man in a dark coat." Thorne nodded, his gaze drifting toward the clubhouse in the distance. The London City Golf Club, with its polished image and exclusive membership, was a haven for the wealthy and influential. But beneath its glossy surface, Thorne suspected, lay a tangle of secrets and grudges. He turned back to the scene, his thoughts already racing. Richard Halford had been a divisive figure, respected by some, resented by others. His death was no random act, and Thorne knew that unraveling the truth would require peeling back the layers of the club's carefully curated facade. As the morning sun climbed higher, casting long shadows across the green, Thorne couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning. The fairways might have been immaculate, but the story they concealed was anything but. Chapter 2, A Game of Masks. The London City Golf Club buzzed with whispers as the morning unfolded. Members arrived, their polished shoes and tailored outfits clashing starkly with the grim events on the third fairway. They huddled in small groups, murmuring speculation and glancing nervously toward the clubhouse windows. Detective Chief Inspector Hugo Thorne stepped inside, his sharp gaze cutting through the opulent surroundings. The air was heavy with the scent of fresh flowers and polished wood, a veneer of luxury that failed to mask the unease simmering beneath. Geoffrey Renshaw, the club's manager, approached, his demeanor a mix of worry and forced composure. "Detective," he began, extending a hand that Thorne ignored. "This is an unthinkable tragedy. Richard was a pillar of our community." Thorne's expression didn't waver. "I'm sure he was," he said evenly, "but I need to understand exactly what kind of pillar he was. Let's start with his relationships. Friends? Enemies?" Renshaw hesitated, a flicker of discomfort crossing his face. "Richard was a perfectionist," he admitted. "He had high standards, and not everyone appreciated that, but he was dedicated to his work." Thorne folded his arms, his piercing eyes fixed on Renshaw. "Dedication doesn't get a man killed, Mr. Stang." "Renshaw, resentment does. Let's not dance around it. Who had issues with him?" The manager glanced around, as if the polished walls themselves might betray him. There were disagreements, he admitted reluctantly, with members, staff, but nothing serious, at least not that I was aware of. Thorne made a mental note of the evasion. We'll circle back to that. For now, I need access to club records, membership lists, staff schedules, financial documents, everything. Of course, Renshaw said quickly. I'll have them sent to you. Thorne nodded, already moving toward the lounge where several members had gathered. Their conversation hushed as he approached, their smiles strained. He could almost hear the unspoken thought among them. Why him? Or, more tellingly, how much does he know? Ladies and gentlemen, Thorne began, his voice firm but measured. I'm Detective Chief Inspector Thorne, leading the investigation into Richard Halford's death. I'll need to speak with each of you individually. A blonde woman in a tailored navy dress stepped forward, her expression poised but wary. I'm Miranda Talbot, the event coordinator. Richard and I worked closely on many projects. Anything I can do to help, Detective? Thorne gave a small nod, noting her polished demeanor. We'll start with you, then. They moved to a private corner where Thorne wasted no time. What can you tell me about Richard's last few days? Did he seem off? Anxious? Miranda hesitated, her perfectly manicured nails tapping against the edge of her chair. Richard always carried himself with an air of intensity, she said carefully. But recently, he seemed more on edge. He mentioned feeling watched. Watched by whom? Thorne pressed. I don't know, Miranda admitted. He wasn't one to share much, but there were moments when he'd stop mid-sentence, like he'd heard something no one else could. It was unsettling. Thorne leaned back slightly, his mind connecting threads. Did he mention any conflicts? Arguments with members or staff? Miranda's gaze shifted, her hesitation speaking volumes. Richard had his share of run-ins, she admitted. He wasn't afraid to call people out if they weren't up to his standards. That didn't always make him popular. Names, Miss Talbot. Who didn't he get along with? She hesitated again, but finally relented. Colin Hargrave, she said quietly. A retired colonel who's been a member here for years. They clashed over the course renovations. Richard wanted to modernize, and Colin insisted on preserving tradition. Their arguments were heated. Thorne made a note. Anyone else? Miranda's lips pressed into a thin line. You might want to talk to Ethan McKay. He's Richard's apprentice. Or was. They had a falling out recently, but I don't know the details. As Thorne wrapped up the conversation, his thoughts churned. A web of tension and rivalry was beginning to take shape, but the strands were far from untangled. He stepped back into the main lounge, his gaze sweeping over the room. Colin Hargrave stood near the bar, his rigid posture and stern expression a stark contrast to the nervous energy of the other members. Ethan McKay lingered near the entrance, his young face shadowed by an unreadable intensity. Thorne's instincts prickled. The fairways might have been pristine, but the people who walked them were anything but. Chapter 3. A Tangle of Lies. Detective Chief Inspector Hugo Thorne crossed the lounge with deliberate strides, his focus locking onto Colin Hargrave. The retired colonel exuded an air of authority, his tailored blazer and precise stance giving him the appearance of a man unaccustomed to compromise. Colonel Hargrave, Thorne began, his voice calm but firm, a moment of your time. The colonel turned, his sharp features set in a neutral expression. Detective, he replied curtly, offering a handshake. Thorne reluctantly accepted. I trust this unpleasantness will be resolved quickly? That depends, Thorne replied, watching Hargrave closely. I understand you had disagreements with Mr. Halford. Hargrave's jaw tightened, but his response was measured. Disagreements, yes, heated at times, but nothing unusual. Richard was passionate about his work. I respected that, even if I didn't always agree with his methods. Passionate enough to drive someone to murder. Thorne pressed, his words cutting through the polished veneer of civility. Hargrave's eyes narrowed. You're suggesting I killed him? Preposterous. Richard and I may have clashed, but I had no reason to harm him. No reason, Thorne echoed, his tone thoughtful. Yet I'm told your arguments were about more than just renovations. Something about financial discrepancies? Hargrave stiffened, his composure slipping for the briefest moment. I don't know where you're getting your information, Detective, but I assure you I've done nothing improper. Thorne let the silence stretch, watching as Hargrave shifted uncomfortably. Finally, he nodded. We'll talk again. Don't leave town. As Hargrave walked away, his shoulders rigid, Thorne turned his attention to the young man lingering near the entrance. Ethan McKay, Richard Halford's apprentice, had the wiry frame and restless energy of someone unaccustomed to standing still. "Ethan," Thorne called, motioning him over. The apprentice hesitated before approaching, his hands stuffed into the pockets of his worn jacket. "You're the detective, right?" Ethan said, his voice edged with nervousness. "I figured you'd want to talk to me." "I do," Thorne replied, gesturing to a quiet corner. "Let's sit." Once seated, Thorne studied the young man. There was a rawness to Ethan, a mix of defiance and vulnerability. "Tell me about your relationship with Mr. Halford." Ethan shrugged, his gaze darting to the floor. "He was tough, but fair. Taught me a lot. I didn't always agree with him, but I respected him." "Respected him enough to stay after your falling out?" Thorne asked, his voice calm but probing. Ethan's head snapped up, his eyes flashing. "Who told you that? Miranda, she doesn't know the full story." "Then why don't you tell me?" Thorne suggested, leaning forward slightly. Ethan hesitated, his jaw tightening. "We argued about priorities. He wanted me to focus on the maintenance side, but I was more interested in design. Thought I had potential to do more, you know? He didn't see it that way." "Was that enough to make you angry?" Thorne asked. "Angry enough to do something you'd regret?" Ethan recoiled, his face pale. "No, I didn't. Look, I argued with him, sure, but I didn't hurt him. I'd never—" Thorne held up a hand, cutting him off. "Calm down, Ethan. I'm just trying to get a sense of the situation." The young man sagged in his chair, his earlier bravado crumbling. Richard was tough, but he wasn't a bad guy. He didn't deserve this. Thorne studied Ethan for a moment longer, then nodded. "If you think of anything else, anything that might help, contact me immediately." Ethan nodded, his expression subdued. As Thorne stood, his mind churned with questions. Both Hargrave and McKay had motives, though neither seemed like the type to stage such a grotesque scene. Still, appearances could be deceiving. Thorne's phone buzzed, breaking his train of thought. He answered with a clipped, "Thorne." "Sir," an officer said, "you'll want to see this. We found something in Halford's office." "I'm on my way," Thorne replied, his pulse quickening. Whatever they'd uncovered, he hoped it would begin to untangle the web of deceit surrounding the London City Golf Club. As he stepped outside, the crisp air hit him like a slap. The day was warming, but the shadows cast by the morning's events remained as cold as ever. Thorne knew this case was far from over. If anything, the game had just begun. Chapter 4: Secrets in the Office. Detective Chief Inspector Hugo Thorne entered Richard Halford's office, a compact but meticulously organized space tucked away behind the clubhouse. The faint scent of leather and varnish hung in the air, a testament to Halford's penchant for precision. His desk, an imposing piece of oak furniture, was neatly arranged until now. A junior officer stood near the desk, holding a sealed evidence bag containing a bundle of papers. "This was in the bottom drawer, sir," the officer said, handing the bag to Thorne. "Looks like correspondence. Some of it's dated as recently as last week." Thorne opened the bag and pulled out the documents. The first was a typed letter from Colin Hargrave, unmistakable with its formal language and aggressive undertone. Thorne scanned it quickly. "Richard, the changes you're proposing to the course are not only unnecessary but an affront to the traditions we've upheld for decades. I will not stand by while you ruin what so many of us hold dear. You've been warned. Colin Hargrave." Thorne's lips tightened. It wasn't a smoking gun, but it confirmed what Miranda Talbot had hinted at. Hargrave had been more than just vocal in his disagreements with Halford. He moved on to the next piece of correspondence, this one handwritten in a scrawling, almost frantic style. The signature at the bottom read Ethan McKay. It was less a letter and more of a plea. "Richard, I don't know what else to say to make you understand. I need this chance. Please reconsider. I can't stay here if you won't let me grow." Thorne set the note aside, his mind cataloging the growing list of suspects and motives. Then his attention caught on a third document, this one far more perplexing. It was a printed email chain between Halford and an unknown sender. The messages were terse and cryptic. From anonymous sender at encrypted.com to Richard Halford, subject payment. "You're late. Deliver what you promised or I go public." Halford's reply was curt, "I need more time. You'll get your money." Thorne's brow furrowed. "Anonymous threats and financial dealings," he murmured, his voice low. What were you hiding, Halford? Detective, the officer interrupted, holding up another bag containing a small key. This was taped to the underside of the drawer. Looks like it might open something small, maybe a safe. Thorne took the key, weighing it in his hand. Halford's office didn't have an obvious safe, but the man clearly had secrets. Thorne's gaze swept the room, his sharp eyes lingering on the bookshelves lining the far wall. The shelves were perfectly arranged, the kind of symmetry that spoke to an obsessive personality. And yet one book, a faded hardcover on coarse design, seemed ever so slightly misaligned. He stepped closer, pulling the book free. It was heavier than it should have been. Flipping it open, he found the hollowed-out center containing a leather-bound notebook. Inside the notebook were pages of meticulous notes, detailing cash transactions, names, and dates. Some names were familiar, Hargrave McKay, but others were more obscure, initials and pseudonyms that hinted at a clandestine network of dealings. Thorne's finger ran down the page until it stopped on an entry dated 3 weeks ago. CH, 25K for silence. CH, Thorne muttered. Colin Hargrave? It wasn't definitive, but it was a thread worth pulling. He tucked the notebook into an evidence bag, already planning his next move. As Thorne left the office, the afternoon sun cast long shadows across the clubhouse lawn. The pieces of the puzzle were beginning to take shape, but the picture they formed was far from clear. He had suspects, motives, and now, tantalizing hints of a deeper conspiracy. But for every answer, new questions arose. Why was Halford paying for someone's silence? And what could be so damning that it was worth that much money? As Thorne walked back toward his car, he spotted Miranda Talbot near the clubhouse entrance, speaking to a man he didn't recognize. The man's body language was tense, his movements sharp as he gestured toward her. Miranda, for her part, looked uncharacteristically flustered. Thorne made a mental note to follow up with her later. For now, he had a retired colonel to question, and a sense that the darkness lurking behind the golf club's polished facade was far deeper than he'd imagined. Chapter 5. The Colonel's Secrets. Detective Chief Inspector Hugo Thorne parked his car outside Colin Hargrave's stately townhouse, its Georgian facade a stark contrast to the storm brewing in Thorne's mind. The retired colonel had become an increasingly compelling figure in this tangled web, and Thorne had no intention of letting him slip through the cracks. The housekeeper, a quiet woman in her 50s, let Thorne in with little fanfare. "The colonel is in the study," she said, her voice low. "He's been expecting you." The study was every bit as austere as Thorne expected. Dark wood paneling, military memorabilia, and shelves lined with books on strategy and history. Colin Hargrave stood by the fireplace, a glass of amber liquid in his hand. "Detective," Hargrave greeted, his tone clipped. "To what do I owe this persistent interest?" Thorne didn't waste time with pleasantries. He pulled the sealed evidence bag from his pocket, holding it up for the colonel to see. "I found this in Richard Halford's office. Recognize it?" Hargrave's eyes flicked to the notebook, his expression carefully neutral. "Should I?" "Your initials appear here," Thorne said, stepping closer and opening the bag. He pointed to the entry. £25,000, payment for silence. Care to explain? The colonel's grip on his glass tightened, but his voice remained steady. "Detective, I'm sure you're aware that in institutions like the London City Golf Club, discretion is often necessary. People make mistakes, rumors spread. Sometimes it's better to nip these things in the bud." "And what mistake required Richard Halford to pay you a small fortune?" Thorne pressed. Hargrave set his glass down with deliberate care, his jaw tightening. "It wasn't a mistake on his part. It was mine. A lapse in judgment during a charity event last year. A misunderstanding with one of the staff." "Misunderstanding," Thorne repeated, his tone laced with skepticism. The colonel's expression darkened. "I'm not proud of it, Detective. Halford found out and threatened to inform the board. I convinced him to reconsider. A financial arrangement was made, and the matter was resolved." Thorne studied Hargrave's face, searching for cracks in his carefully constructed facade. If the matter was resolved, why the continued tension between you two? Why the threatening letter? Hargrave bristled. "Because Halford wasn't content to let it rest. He enjoyed holding it over me. Every renovation proposal, every budget review, he found ways to remind me that my reputation was in his hands." Thorne let the silence stretch, watching Hargrave squirm under the weight of his own words. Finally, he said, "Where were you last night between 8 and midnight?" "Here," Hargrave replied without hesitation. "I had dinner with my daughter, then retired to bed. My housekeeper can confirm." Thorne noted the alibi but didn't comment. "One more thing, Colonel. Do you know anything about an anonymous email threatening Halford?" Hargrave's brows furrowed. "Anonymous email? No, I don't." "Interesting," Thorne said, tucking the notebook back into his pocket, "because someone clearly wanted Halford under pressure, and you're the only one so far with a history of silencing problems with money." Hargrave's face reddened, his composure cracking. "If you think I killed him, arrest me. Otherwise, I suggest you find someone else to harass." Thorne stared him down, the tension thick in the air. "You're not off the hook, Colonel. Stay available." As Thorne left the townhouse, his mind raced. Hargrave's alibi was flimsy, his motives undeniable, but something didn't add up. The colonel seemed more a man desperate to protect his reputation than one willing to kill to preserve it. Back in his car, Thorne's phone buzzed. It was an officer at the station. "Detective, we've uncovered more emails on Halford's computer. One of them mentions a meeting on the night of the murder. It's cryptic, but it's scheduled for the 3rd fairway at 9:30 p.m. Thorne's pulse quickened. Was there a name attached to the email? "No name, just the initials EM. "Ethan McKay," Thorne murmured. This case just got a lot more complicated. As he drove toward the station, the pieces of the puzzle shifted once more. Hargrave's secrets were damning, but Ethan McKay had now emerged as more than just a disgruntled apprentice. The meeting on the 3rd fairway suggested a connection neither man was willing to admit. One thing was clear. The game of masks and motives at the London City Golf Club was far from over, and Thorne was running out of patience to play it. Chapter 6. Shadows Beneath the Surface. The drive to the station felt longer than usual, Thorne's mind swirling with possibilities. Hargrave's confession added one layer, but the anonymous email and Ethan McKay's connection raised entirely new questions. As the city lights blurred past, he felt the weight of a case that refused to settle into a clean narrative. By the time he reached the station, the air inside was charged. The junior officer who had called him earlier stood ready, a folder in hand. "Here are the emails, sir," the officer said, passing them over. Thorne flipped through the pages. Most of the messages were mundane, routine scheduling, equipment orders, and updates on course maintenance. But then he found the email that had set his pulse racing. From unknown sender at securemail.com to Richard Halford, subject, "Tonight, meet me at the 3rd fairway at 9:30. Come alone. It's time we settled this." The cryptic tone was ominous enough, but the timestamp, just hours before Halford's death, added a sinister urgency. The initials at the end of the message, EM, couldn't be ignored. Ethan McKay was already on Thorne's radar, but this was something else entirely, a potential smoking gun. "Is McKay still at the clubhouse?" Thorne asked the officer, already reaching for his coat. "Yes, sir. He hasn't left since this morning." "Good, let's pay him another visit." When Thorne arrived back at the London City Golf Club, the sun was sinking low, casting long shadows across the grounds. The pristine lawns and elegant clubhouse seemed almost mocking, their perfection at odds with the darkness creeping beneath their surface. Ethan McKay was in the maintenance shed, crouched over a piece of equipment with grease-stained hands. He looked up as Thorne entered, his expression shifting from surprise to wariness. "Detective," Ethan said, wiping his hands on a rag. "Something else you need?" "You could say that." Thorne pulled out a copy of the email and held it up. "Care to explain this?" Ethan's eyes widened as he read the message, his face draining of color. I don't know anything about this," he stammered. "I didn't send that." "It's signed with your initials," Thorne pressed, his voice low and measured, "and it references a meeting at the exact location where Richard Halford was found dead." "I swear, I didn't send it," Ethan insisted, his voice rising. "I wasn't even near the 3rd fairway last night. I was here in the shed working late." "Do you have anyone who can corroborate that?" Thorne asked, his gaze unrelenting. Ethan hesitated, then shook his head. "No, I was alone." Thorne studied him for a long moment. The fear in Ethan's eyes was genuine, but fear didn't equal innocence. "If you're lying to me, Ethan, now's the time to come clean. I've got a dead man and your name written all over the evidence." "I'm not lying." Ethan's voice cracked. "Yes, I argued with Richard. Yes, I was upset about how he treated me, but I didn't kill him. I wouldn't." Thorne cut him off. "Then tell me about the meeting. If you didn't send the email, who did?" Ethan hesitated, his hands clenching into fists. "I don't know, but Richard mentioned someone had been blackmailing him. He didn't say who, but he seemed scared." "Blackmail?" Thorne's interest sharpened. "Did he say what it was about?" "No," Ethan admitted. "But he said it wasn't about money. It was bigger than that. Something that could ruin him." The pieces shifted again in Thorne's mind, forming an even darker picture. If Halford had been blackmailed, it added another layer of complexity to the case. But who had enough leverage over him to pull it off? And why would they resort to murder? Thorne pulled back, his voice softening. "If you're telling the truth, Ethan, I'll find out. But if there's anything else you're hiding, now's the time to say it." Ethan shook his head, his expression bleak. "I've told you everything I know." Thorne left the shed with more questions than answers. Ethan's fear seemed real, but fear could be faked, and the blackmail angle opened a door to possibilities he hadn't yet considered. As he stepped back onto the fairway, the first stars began to pierce the twilight sky. The beauty of the scene was at odds with the shadows gathering around the case. Somewhere in this carefully curated world of privilege and appearances, the truth was waiting to be unearthed. Thorne vowed to find it, no matter how many masks he had to rip away to get there. Chapter 7. Whispers of Betrayal. Detective Chief Inspector Hugo Thorne strode back toward the clubhouse, his mind racing. The mention of blackmail introduced a new element, one that could change everything. If Richard Halford was being coerced, perhaps the murder was more than personal. It could be the fallout of a much larger scheme. Inside the clubhouse, the atmosphere was subdued, the usual hum of casual conversation replaced by uneasy whispers. Thorne found Miranda Talbot seated in the corner of the lounge, her posture rigid as she nursed a glass of wine. Her earlier composure had given way to something rawer, fear, or perhaps guilt. "Miss Talbot," Thorne said as he approached, "we need to talk." She glanced up, her eyes widening slightly. "Detective," she replied, her voice tight. "Have you made any progress?" Thorne didn't answer immediately. Instead, he motioned for her to follow him to a quieter space. Once they were alone, he leaned against the doorframe, his gaze sharp. "What can you tell me about Richard Halford being blackmailed?" Miranda's glass froze halfway to her lips. "Blackmailed," she echoed, the color draining from her face. I don't know what you're talking about." Thorne studied her, his instincts prickling. "Ethan McKay claims Halford mentioned it to him, said it wasn't about money, but something more damaging. If you know anything, now's the time to share." Miranda set her glass down, her hands trembling slightly. "Richard was under a lot of pressure," she admitted. "I noticed he was more paranoid recently, checking his phone constantly, avoiding certain members. But he didn't tell me why." Thorne's eyes narrowed. "Did he mention anyone specifically? Someone who might have had leverage over him?" Miranda hesitated, her gaze darting away. "There was a man," she said finally. "He wasn't a member, but I saw him around the grounds a few times, always late at night. Richard said he was handling it, so I didn't ask questions." "What did this man look like?" Thorne pressed. "Tall, dark hair, always wearing a coat. I never caught his name." Thorne's mind churned. A mysterious figure lurking on the grounds added yet another layer to an already tangled case. He filed the description away, knowing he'd need to dig deeper. "Anything else?" he asked, his tone gentler now. Even the smallest detail could help. Miranda hesitated again, her expression conflicted. "There's something," she said finally. "About 3 weeks ago, Richard asked me to cancel an event booking for the Hargrave family. It was unusual. They host a charity tournament every year, and it's always been a big deal. But he was adamant." Thorne's brow furrowed. "Did he say why?" "No," Miranda replied. "But when I told Colin Hargrave, he was furious. He stormed into Richard's office that same day. I don't know what was said, but Richard looked shaken afterward." Thorne's jaw tightened. Hargrave's connection to the case was growing stronger with every new piece of information. But the blackmail and the cancelled event hinted at something deeper, a hidden conflict that hadn't yet come to light. "Thank you, Miss Talbot," Thorne said, straightening. If you remember anything else, call me." She nodded, her expression troubled. "Detective, do you think whoever did this is still around? At the club?" Thorne's gaze was steady. "I don't rule anything out." As Thorne stepped out into the cool evening air, his phone buzzed. It was the junior officer again. "Detective," the officer said, his tone urgent. "We've identified the source of the anonymous emails to Halford. They were sent from a public library terminal just a mile from the club. Security footage shows someone matching Ethan McKay's description, entering and using the terminal on multiple occasions." Thorne's stomach twisted. "How recent?" "2 days ago was the last instance. We're pulling the footage now." Thorne ended the call, his thoughts racing. The evidence against Ethan was mounting, but something about it felt off. The young man's panic earlier seemed genuine, and the blackmail thread suggested a more complex dynamic. Was Ethan truly guilty, or was someone using him as a pawn? Back at his car, Thorne leaned against the hood, staring out at the darkened course. The golf club's polished facade had cracked, revealing a maze of secrets and betrayals. But the deeper he delved, the more elusive the truth became. Somewhere in this tangled web, the answers lay waiting. Thorne could feel it, just out of reach, like the faint whisper of a breeze on the quiet fairway. He wasn't leaving until he unraveled it. Chapter 8. The final piece. Detective Chief Inspector Hugo Thorne parked his car outside the public library, the location where the anonymous emails to Richard Halford had been sent. The building was modest, a relic of the city's past, its facade worn but functional. Inside, the smell of aged books mingled with the faint hum of computers. An officer greeted him at the entrance. "We've pulled the footage, sir," she said, leading him to a small room where a monitor played the security recordings. "This is from 2 days ago." Thorne leaned in as the video rolled. A young man entered the frame, his face partially obscured by a hood. The height, build, and nervous energy were unmistakable. It was Ethan McKay. "Pause it," Thorne ordered. The officer complied, freezing the image just as Ethan sat at a terminal. His hands hovered over the keyboard, his body language tense. "What time was this?" "Just after 7 p.m., the officer replied. "We cross-referenced the timestamps with the emails sent to Halford. It matches." Thorne stared at the screen, his gut tightening. Ethan's involvement seemed undeniable, but something still felt wrong. The young man's fear during their last conversation was too raw, too uncalculated. If Ethan had orchestrated this, he wasn't acting alone. "Is there footage of him leaving?" Thorne asked. The officer nodded, fast-forwarding the video. Moments later, Ethan stood, his movements hurried as he exited the library. A second figure appeared on the edge of the frame, a tall man in a dark coat, his face turned away from the camera. "Who's that?" Thorne asked, his voice sharp. "We're not sure," the officer admitted. "He didn't use any of the terminals, just lingered near the entrance. We're trying to enhance the image." Thorne's mind raced. The mysterious man matched Miranda Talbot's description of the figure seen around the golf club. If he was connected to Ethan, this could be the link that tied everything together. "Send me everything you have on this man," Thorne said, "and put out a bolo. I want him found." Back at the London City Golf Club, Thorne found Ethan McKay in the maintenance shed once again. The young man froze when he saw the detective, his eyes widening in alarm. "I need answers, Ethan," Thorne said, his tone firm. "We have footage of you sending emails to Halford from a library terminal, emails that led to his death." Ethan's face crumpled. "I didn't mean for this to happen," he whispered, his voice shaking. I didn't know it would go this far." Thorne stepped closer, his gaze unrelenting. "Then tell me the truth. Who were you working with? Who's the man in the coat?" Ethan hesitated, his hands trembling. "I don't know his name," he admitted. "He approached me weeks ago, said he knew about my arguments with Richard. He offered me money to rattle him, to make him think someone was out to get him." "And you agreed," Thorne pressed. "I needed the money," Ethan said, his voice breaking. "But I didn't know he was going to kill him. I swear I thought it was just scare tactics." Thorne's jaw tightened. "What did this man look like?" "Tall, dark hair, always in that coat," Ethan said. "He didn't say much, just gave me instructions and cash." "Did he ever mention why he wanted to scare Halford?" Ethan shook his head. "No, but he seemed angry, like he had a score to settle." Thorne's mind churned. The man in the coat was clearly the orchestrator, but his motives remained a mystery. Was it personal, financial, or something even darker? "Where did you meet him?" Thorne asked. "The old storage building near the 8th hole," Ethan said. "He always showed up there, late at night." That night, Thorne and his team approached the abandoned storage building. The air was heavy with tension, the quiet of the golf course broken only by the crunch of gravel beneath their boots. Inside, the building was dimly lit, its shelves covered in dust and cobwebs. But in the center of the room, a makeshift office had been set up, folding chairs, a table, and a stack of papers strewn across the surface. "Over here," one of the officers called, holding up a piece of paper. It was a printout of the same email thread Thorne had found in Halford's office, but with handwritten notes scrawled in the margins. The notes were chilling in their precision. Pressure him to confess. Make him pay. Thorne's stomach twisted as the pieces fell into place. This wasn't just about scaring Halford, it was about retribution. Suddenly, the faint sound of footsteps echoed from outside. Thorne motioned for silence, his hand hovering over his weapon. The door creaked open, and a tall figure stepped inside, his coat brushing against the floor. "Freeze!" Thorne barked, his voice cutting through the stillness. The man froze, his hand slowly rising. In the dim light, Thorne finally saw his face, sharp features, dark eyes, and a cold, calculating expression. "You've been busy," Thorne said, stepping closer. "Who are you, and why did you want Richard Halford dead?" The man smirked, his gaze unwavering. "You think you've figured it out, don't you, detective? But you have no idea what he did, what he destroyed." "What did he destroy?" Thorne demanded, his voice edged with steel. The man's smirk faded, replaced by a flicker of pain. "He took everything from me, my career, my family, my reputation, all because I didn't fit into his perfect little world." As the officers moved in to secure the man, Thorne felt the weight of the case finally begin to lift. The truth was uglier than he'd imagined, but at least now, the shadows were starting to recede. But as he stepped back into the night, he couldn't shake the feeling that the darkness surrounding the London City Golf Club would never truly be gone. Epilogue: The final swing. The London City Golf Club reopened a week after the arrest, its pristine fairways once again bustling with members. The tragedy of Richard Halford's death was buried beneath a veneer of civility, whispered about in hushed tones, but never truly addressed. For many, the incident became just another uncomfortable chapter in the club's storied history, a secret to be polished over like a tarnished trophy. Detective Chief Inspector Hugo Thorne sat in his office, reviewing the final case report. The man they'd arrested, Daniel Moore, was a former caddy who had worked under Halford years ago. Back then, Moore had been a rising talent in the golf world, until Halford discovered a minor infraction and reported it to the club's board. What should have been a reprimand escalated, resulting in Moore's expulsion and the collapse of his career. The bitterness had festered for years, finally erupting into the carefully orchestrated campaign of fear that ended in murder. Thorne closed the file, his brow furrowing. The case was solved, but the lingering questions left him uneasy. Why had Moore involved Ethan McKay? Was it purely opportunistic, or was there more to their connection? And what about Colin Hargrave's secret payments to Halford? While unrelated to the murder, they hinted at deeper rot within the club's elite circles. His phone buzzed, interrupting his thoughts. It was Miranda Talbot. "Detective," she said, her voice subdued, "I just wanted to thank you for bringing closure." Thorne leaned back in his chair. "Closure is a tricky thing, Miss Talbot. For some, maybe. For others, the wounds are just beginning to show." There was a pause on the line, then a sigh. "The club is already moving on. New head greenkeeper, fresh coat of paint. But you're right, the shadows are still there. They always are." Thorne hung up, her words lingering in the air. He grabbed his coat and headed out, the chill of the evening biting at his skin as he stepped into the city streets. The London City Golf Club might be returning to business as usual, but for him, the case was a stark reminder of the fragility of appearances. People polished their lives like the club polished its greens, hiding the cracks beneath the surface. But in the end, the truth had a way of breaking through, messy, jagged, and impossible to ignore. As Thorne walked into the night, his thoughts already turned to the next case. The city had no shortage of shadows, and it was his job to step into them, no matter how cold or how deep.